Greetings, classicists, and welcome to Book 19, and then we shall do Book 20. Thank you. Impeccable timing. We shall do Book 20 just as a very brief overview, because remember, Book 20 is not a set text, so you won't get specific questions based on Book 20, although of course you can refer to it in the exam and you will get credit. So anyway, let us move on with Book 19. So before we start, test your brilliance and the quality and depth of your reading with the Book 19 test, which should be attached. God, sorry, it's late. Attached. So do the test and mark yourself. So nice simple test. You should be getting 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Really, you should be getting 10 out of 10. You really need to know that level of information and in reality deeper to do well in the final exam. So 10 questions, so give yourselves 3 minutes and the extension as well. Off you go. Good, well done. So a little detour if you like, but what is this used for and how do we know? Maybe what do you think it's used for? It is a boar spear, and the way you can tell that it's a boar spear is because it's got that crossbar, and the reason why it's got a crossbar is because boars, although you may stab them with the sharp and pointy bit, they will keep charging down the spear and kill you, even though they've got a spear through them. Whereas if you have that little crossbar, that stops them reaching you. So that's how dangerous, strong and potentially terrifying a boar is. And of course, that is relevant, as you all know from the reading, at the end of Book 19, when we see the scar on Odysseus' leg caused by a boar hunt. So what do you get for boar hunting? Well, bacon. Do you get bacon from boars? I don't know. Well, anyway, moving on, you get kleos. Boars are extremely dangerous animals, and in an ancient, wilder world, animals like boars will damage crops and scare people, potentially even kill people. So from a human's perspective, controlling wild animals and dealing with them is actually an extremely important and brave thing to do. So you would receive a lot of kleos for killing a male boar, and that's something that's even one of the tasks of Hercules. That's how terrifying boars are, potentially. So there you go. There's a nice picture of a boar. It looks quite cuddly there, but they're quite vicious. So one of the largest boars ever recorded was 477 kilograms in weight and 2.84 meters long. So that's almost half a ton and 3 meters worth of angry pig. So when a hero is fighting a boar, that is not coshing some pink little babe style piglet over the head with a club. That is dealing with a large, powerful, dangerous animal, and of course there is kleos and danger associated with it. Now, this is just a clip. It may not work, and it's about 2 minutes long, and it's just a huge boar running around a forest for about 60 seconds. So if you want to type it all into YouTube and then see what a boar would actually look like in reality, then do, but don't worry, it's really not crucial for the lesson, and it's an old link, so it may well have decayed anyway. But take on board, boars are big, fierce, scary animals. So let's get stuck into Book 19. So Odysseus is obviously in his palace, and he's received abuse from the suitors all the way back in Book 18. He's been forced to fight Iris, the beggar. His identity has been tested, or rather his desire to reveal his identity has been tested to the very limit. He has been testing suitors and maids and servants, and at least considered Penelope and her fidelity, I suspect. And book 19 is a little more of that. Book 19 is probably more about Odysseus and Penelope. Maybe he's done the suitors and he's done the household, and we're looking at it from another angle, that of Odysseus and Penelope, although there's a sort of interplay of all of them throughout. So we get a very interesting and important scene with Melantho in book 19, lines 53 to 100, where Melantho is openly and publicly abusing Odysseus, and that is extremely significant because Odysseus is a guest of the household and Melantho is a slave / servant of the household, and she should be deeply respectful of anyone that they choose to give Xenia to. So abusing him openly is it's a strange and unusual thing to do, and it shows that there are real problems in the household. Now we know that Melantho is having an affair with Eurymachus, and this is absolutely forbidden because she doesn't have the authority or the agency to make that kind of choice, who she sleeps with, to form a relationship. The best way to look at her and Eumaeus and Melanthius and Philotius is probably as slaves, although they have a slightly strange, they occupy a quite strange status. We tend to view slaves in a more Atlantic slave trade type of slavery, where slaves are, worked to death, and they are, very, very inferior, and they're almost not human in their sort of relationship with, or viewed as not human in their relationship with their masters. Whereas ancient slavery is a little bit more different. The boundaries between a slave and a master do become a little bit more blurred, and some slaves feel much more like what we would consider to be servants, so people of a lower status, but people who you still have a sort of potentially friendly relationship with. Anyway, Melantho doesn't have the right to have an affair with Melanthius. It's like your toaster wandering off and cooking toast for someone in the house next door. It's not something that she should be allowed to do. So really it symbolises the loss of control of the oikos, the damage that the suitors have inflicted on Odysseus' household, and to a degree Ithaca, but also the damage that has resulted from Odysseus not being there. There is no man, there's no hero in charge of the oikos, and so things inevitably fall apart. Now Penelope is doing her best. Telemachus, as a young man, is arguably doing his best, although he's inherently flawed. And so again, we're seeing the consequences of the absence of Odysseus. It's also important to point out that Odysseus again warns Melantho, if you like, for her bad behaviour through a moral tale, not a particularly long and developed one, but just pointing out the consequences of not listening to the gods, of behaving immorally, and again warning that Odysseus will be back. So at least giving her the chance to mend her ways, which unsurprisingly she doesn't do. So we then get an interesting scene between Odysseus and Penelope. They're meeting for the first time in reality, and quite a sad scene in some ways, in that this is what Odysseus has been waiting for 20 years. Remember, he was on the island of Calypso pining for Penelope. The reason why he wants to go back so badly is Penelope. He rejects Nausicaa, arguably for Penelope. Penelope is fundamental. Sorry, we're getting a bit of distraction. Say hello, Loki. Yeah, there we go. There's two of them. They look very similar, but there's two. Anyway, so Penelope, again, you can read the Odyssey in a variety of different ways, but you can argue that it is Penelope who is fundamental to Odysseus's identity, and that is why he is returning home. And so his first meeting of Penelope after 20 years is quite sad because he can't reveal his identity. It seems as though Penelope has no idea who he is. And this is not the embrace and homecoming that Odysseus wants. And so in some ways, it's actually quite a sad and tragic scene, although by the end, by book 23, they make up for it. Now, one thing to think about is in these conversations between Odysseus and Penelope is to what extent Odysseus is testing Penelope by examining her responses, and to what extent Penelope knows or suspects that Odysseus is the beggar. Now remember, Penelope has received prophecy after prophecy that that Odysseus is still alive and is on his way home, or is at home, or as Theoclymenus says, he is at home and seeking information about who's been good and who's been bad. So it's not as though Penelope hasn't got some inclination that Odysseus may be back. But does she work out that the beggar's Odysseus? Is she suspicious the beggar's is Odysseus? It's very much up to you, because Homer cleverly never truly reveals it, I would argue. Anyway, in this scene, Odysseus speaks to Penelope, and one of the words that he uses, or starts using, or he starts his speech with rather, is the word "my lady." Now, in Greek, that can translate as lady, or it can translate as wife. So has Odysseus sort of slipped up and used the word wife when he didn't mean to, and fortunately it's misinterpreted as simply the word lady? Or is this a subtle hint from Odysseus? Is he using a deliberately ambiguous word to get Penelope to start thinking about the fact that he may be Odysseus? Or is he simply just reminding her that she is the wife of Odysseus and isn't trying to reveal or even hint at his identity? There's a lot of complexity to Odysseus's speeches, potentially, as always. So Odysseus speaks to Penelope, and he gives his story about how he was rich and now he's poor and now he's a man of many sorrows, and that also is an interesting description of himself, because Odysseus, the word Odysseus, can be translated into Greek as the bringer of sorrow, or the bringer of pain. So it's, there's all sorts of little linguistic tricks going on there, and I think, is Odysseus trying to reveal his identity? Is he hinting at his identity? Or is it simply a literary device by which Homer increases the tension? There's mounting suspense and tension until Odysseus's identity is revealed. Again, it's up to you, and there's no clear answer. So I've got one on my lap, and I've got one. Okay, fine. There we go. So Odysseus is speaking to Penelope, and Penelope responds. Now, a couple of questions that I want you to think about. How does Penelope emphasize her loyalty and good character to the beggar? Why might she do this? And why does she persist in asking about the beggar's family? So, as always, jot down some notes, jot down some ideas, read through the passage, pause. Don't just sit. Sorry, I'm having a punch up now. Don't just sit there and listen to my thoughts. You need to do the reading and reinforce your knowledge, and so on and so forth. So anyway, consider those questions. Right. Well, what does Penelope do? And again, we're seeing Penelope show a good ability to speak. We could be seeing Penelope being extremely cunning in that she thinks this beggar might be Odysseus. So what does she need to do? She needs to reinforce the fact that she has been absolutely faithful and that she misses Odysseus, and that she is utterly loyal to Odysseus. And she does that in a variety of of different ways, one might argue. So she talks about how her loveliness, her physical beauty is meaningless without Odysseus, and this is what you would want to hear. This is what you would want as Odysseus to hear from one of the most beautiful women in the world, who is renowned for her looks. For her to say that those looks are irrelevant without her husband is a very powerful statement. But again, you don't have to look at it as Penelope being extremely tricky and devious and lying. You know, there's probably, and I would probably read there to be a big element of truth in that. Penelope loves Odysseus, Odysseus loves Penelope. And in the ancient world, or the Homeric world, obviously a woman's identity would be dependent on her husband. So we can always think about the dual nature of speeches, but don't maybe over complicate Penelope in that sense. She also talks about how she has been forced by the suitors and her love of Odysseus to neglect guests. She doesn't have the ability to give them the Xenia that they, or rather she would like to give them, because that's what they deserve. So she again is showing that she understands Xenia, the importance of Xenia, and also she understands shame. You know, she is a moral and good character, a theme that she would be desperate for Odysseus to know, but also desperate for anyone to know. I mean, you can of course look at this as a very sad, lonely Penelope speaking to a beggar and sort of pouring her heart out a bit. So you can be cynical, or you can not. She then tells the story once more of the weaving, how she was weaving a death shroud for Laertes, her father-in-law, so Odysseus' father, which is again a sign of a very good wife. She's still looking after her family duties, even though her husband is missing, possibly dead. She is still doing her duty to her father-in-law, and of course to Telemachus as well. So she is, by telling this story, she is explaining or reinforcing her idea, or reinforcing herself as a good character. So this story of weaving for 3 years to delay the suitors, weaving a death shroud for Laertes, is a very important thing that, as Penelope points out, it's so important that Laertes has a death shroud, and she is the only one who can do it in a sense. And that keeps the suitors busy for 3 years, and then only in the 4th year is the trick revealed by treacherous maids, so Melantho in effect. So once again, we've seen how negative the maids are, how awful the maids are, how the oikos is falling apart without Odysseus at the centre and through the influence of the suitors. So she really is communicating to the beggar or to Odysseus, depending on whether she thinks, suspects, or knows, what a good character is, what a good character she is, how she understands all the values and virtues that a woman should, and how she has remained loyal. So anyway, Penelope asks Odysseus once again about his background, who he is, and that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do in when you've given someone Xenia. It's really a requirement to respond, and so Penelope is not being particularly rude by pushing it, and it's important to understand who you've spoken to and what they've said. If you know who this person is, you may then be able to verify their story, or if you pass on their story to someone else, it would be important to say who it comes from. Remember, there are no newspapers, there's no writing in effect, so much of news, so much of life is through these tellings and retellings of stories from people, through this kind of chain of stories and news, if you like. So it's important to understand who someone is and what their identity is. So Penelope asks, who are you? And again, maybe Penelope is suspicious that the beggar is Odysseus, or that there is something more to the beggar than it would seem. So Penelope says, who are you? And Odysseus responds with another story, another lie based on Crete, and how he was on Crete, and how Odysseus stopped off on his way to the Trojan War, and how the sort of beggar welcomed him in and gave him good Xenia and looked after him. And when Odysseus tells that brief part of the story, Penelope collapses and sort of breaks down in tears. And it would seem as though Odysseus was maybe trying to elicit that response by saying, I saw Odysseus on his way to Troy, in all his glory, when he was young, when he just left Penelope, more or less. This is the reaction Odysseus is hoping for. This again can be viewed as a test. What is Penelope going to do when she hears a story of Odysseus? And she seemingly passes the test. Now, Penelope is still suspicious of the beggar. Is he telling the truth? Is he Odysseus? Certainly I don't think she's got a clear opinion or understanding of who it is, though she may have some inkling. Now, Penelope has been speaking to people for a number of years, and she has been lied to, she has been deceived, she's been misled. There's the suggestion that, I don't know whether people have extorted money from her, but she's given great Xenia to all sorts of people, desperate for news of Odysseus, and people seem to have taken advantage, other people other than the suitors. So now she's a little bit wary about people bringing news of Odysseus. So Odysseus himself is being tested by Penelope. She wants to be sure that this beggar knows Odysseus. And even if she suspects that this is Odysseus, she has to be sure that it's Odysseus too, for obvious reasons. So they have this kind of coded conversation, one might argue, where Penelope basically says, what was Odysseus wearing when you met him? Now, this is because Penelope would have made those clothes. As the lady of the house, she would have made the cloak, she would have made the tunic, she may well have brought him the brooch, she would have been intimately familiar with it. Nonetheless, as a wife, creating, repairing, producing, organising clothing is a kind of crucial wifely duty. So, by asking Odysseus, by knowing what he was wearing, and by asking Odysseus as the beggar what he was wearing, Penelope's also sending a message. She's saying, I love Odysseus so much, I remember what he was wearing the day he left 20 years ago. So is Odysseus giving a kind of coded response? Like, do they know? Do they know? Sorry, I don't want to make too much of that. Anyway, is it likely that the beggar would have remembered what Odysseus was wearing 20 years ago? So if this really was a man from Crete, would he have remembered what Odysseus was wearing 20 years ago, down to the detail of the brooch? 20 years is half a lifetime in the Bronze Age, more for most people. It would seem to be such a strange thing for someone to remember. He's a rich, in theory, the beggar is a rich Cretan who would have met all sorts of people, all sorts of heroes. Maybe Odysseus would have been a standout hero, but would you really have remembered what Odysseus was wearing? Is that a sign is that Odysseus hinting at Penelope that I'm Odysseus? Because only Odysseus would have remembered, because those were his sort of leaving gifts from Penelope. So that was one of the last things Penelope gave him. So of course he's going to remember. And again, because that's one of the last things Penelope gave him, she's going to remember too. So are they exchanging information with each other? Are they testing each other? Odysseus, by recounting the truth, shows that he remembered, and Penelope, by agreeing that that's the truth, shows that she remembered. There's no answer, but we could argue they are both being very careful. They're testing each other, but they're not overcommitting, if you like. Odysseus is still arguably just keeping it all ambiguous in case Penelope has done something wrong and can't truly be trusted, and perhaps the same can be said for Penelope. She certainly doesn't give any hint, really, that she understands, any open, irrevocable hint that she can't take back. Who knows? So, sorry, yes, I have more or less talked through this, but jot these down if you haven't already. So it's important to remember Penelope has been deceived before. As the wife, she would have made the clothes. The detail seems so small. Who, apart from Penelope and Odysseus, would have remembered? On the other hand, we do need to consider that Homer could be just putting in a bit of dramatic license. It's not real. Sorry, spoiler alert. Is this just a way of the author building tension and demonstrating the skill of Odysseus, demonstrating all sorts of other things? Are we reading too much into it? I don't know. It being Homer, probably not. But we need to be a little bit careful about being too logical about things, perhaps. And then, as I said before, there's all sorts of tests of loyalty, identity, and one might argue morality within the story. So what I'd like to do now is a literary question. So it's quite a short passage, but there should be quite a lot there. So the question I want you to answer is, how does Homer emphasize the similarities and differences between the characters of Odysseus and Penelope? So remember, 7 to 8 points, little extract, a word, 2 or 3 words, and then analysis. How does that word demonstrate your answer to the question? You've got 12 minutes, so stop the video, set a timer, and go for it. Good. So we will look at the answers to some of those, or we'll talk through that at a later point. I'll put an exemplar up online for you to look through, I suspect. Anyway, so we keep going with this exchange between Odysseus and Penelope. Now, Odysseus then reveals that he of course saw Odysseus in the past, but he is aware of what Odysseus is doing now. And beggar Odysseus says, Odysseus will be back. He has just stopped off to amass wealth. This is something, after all, that he's very good at. Now, in a modern sense, someone's been away for 20 years, you're thinking, you're stopping off to get money. Surely you'd come back and save the house and sort out the household. But remember, in the Homeric world, stopping to amass time and bringing that wealth back and using it for power and status would be quite an acceptable thing to do. And that's how Odysseus would justify his behavior. Would he have to justify stopping off to amass wealth to his wife Penelope? Probably not. I don't think Homeric wives would hold their husbands to account in that way, especially when later on beggar Odysseus does say, well, Odysseus will be coming back in a month. And that's yet another prophecy, or piece of information rather, on the return of Odysseus. And we do need to keep this in mind, because there are lots and lots of prophecies, statements, stories that Odysseus is coming back and that he's coming back soon. And that's certainly Homer ratcheting up the tension. But it's also interesting for what happens next when Penelope decides to remarry and arranges a test with the suitors in book 21. And the reasons why she does that are, as always, a little bit ambiguous, but especially when you consider how often she's been told that Odysseus is on her way back. Why does she suddenly go, no, okay, he's never coming back, I'm going to marry a suitor? Is it that she's just been lied to too often, and she's had these prophecies before and they've never come true and they don't mean anything? Or is there something deeper at work? We shall see. Now, we then get a very interesting scene with Penelope and Eurycleia and Odysseus. So Odysseus is offered a bath by Penelope, and he basically says, I don't want to be bathed by maids unless there is someone you particularly trust, an old trustworthy maid. Now, again, what's going on here? I think Odysseus is showing his love for Penelope, in a sense, his faithfulness. Sorry, is faithfulness the right word for Odysseus? I don't know, maybe. Anyway, remember with Nausicaa's maids, one way of showing how he was well-intentioned and doing the right thing was to not go anywhere near the maids during bath time, because as we said before, it is more than likely that maids and slave girls bathing a guest might have been forced into some kind of sexual relationship with them at the time. And I think by avoiding or explicitly stating he doesn't want to bathe with young maids, he is kind of making that point as to his good and noble intentions. There is also the more practical side of that, in that Odysseus doesn't trust the maids. He doesn't know who to trust. He doesn't know who not to trust. Melantho has clearly betrayed the Oikos, and Odysseus wants nothing to do with her. And we know that Odysseus has a scar on his thigh that can be used to identify him. Now, presumably none of the young maids would know about it, but you never know. He can't be too careful. And maybe he doesn't completely trust his disguise. So anyway, he accepts a sort of bath or foot wash from Eurycleia, an old and trusted servant. Now, what's interesting is that Eurycleia was Odysseus's wet nurse, so she breastfed Odysseus. She was his mother in some ways. And again, it's this is quite a peculiar slave-servant relationship in the ancient world. It's not quite as we would understand it in a modern slavery context, but it is different when we say the word slave. It is a little bit different in the Homeric world. So we get Eurycleia bathing Odysseus, and she doesn't recognize him, but she starts making references to how much the beggar actually does look like Odysseus, and that's building tension enormously, because what happens if Odysseus is identified before the plan comes to fruition? What happens if Penelope, even with the best will in the world, screams, "Oh, Odysseus," and gives him a hug? What happens if Eurycleia identifies him and says, "Oh, master"? Then he's in trouble. He's going to be killed. So Odysseus is desperate to conceal his identity, and any suggestion that his identity might be revealed makes it tense. Now, this passage does characterize Eurycleia, and this is probably, again, a really important thing from Odysseus' point of view. He needs to understand who he can trust, and he doesn't necessarily ask a lot of searching questions of Eurycleia, but she kind of self-tests, if you like. She tells him what he needs to hear about her character. So even now, 20 years after he's gone, Eurycleia is still talking to what she believes to be a stranger about how wonderful Odysseus was, how he offered a great deal of sacrifice to the gods, how much she misses him. So she's really demonstrating her loyalty. She also talks about her love of Penelope and the sadness that Penelope faces too. So Eurycleia has remained loyal to Odysseus and the Oikos, and thus in some ways can or possibly could be trusted. But is it appropriate for Odysseus to trust anyone of lower status, especially a maid, in this situation? Anyway, whatever suspicions Eurycleia has are confirmed when she sees the scar. And the scar was got God, was received by Odysseus whilst hunting a boar. And Homer goes off on a relatively long digression about Odysseus's boar hunt, and there's quite a lot to it, and it's a story that's again analysed in quite a lot of detail for a number of reasons. The scar isn't ever mentioned before. It's suddenly thrown in to the story, and it's an important story in so many ways, because it tells the story of Odysseus at the same age as Telemachus. So we go right back to Odysseus as a youth, and we get to compare him as a youth to his son and see the vast difference, one might argue, in terms of kleos and bravery and skill. It also reminds us of Odysseus as a warrior, as a fighter. And remember, we haven't had that for a while. We've had Odysseus as a beggar, as a speaker, but there's less of that side of Odysseus in this story. This is Odysseus as a much more conventional, strong Homeric hero, and to be reminded of that before the events that are about to unfold, I think is quite quite powerful in some ways. So there's all sorts to explore there, and all of that is done in the article that I've set, so we're not going to talk about it too much now. So once the digression on the boar is finished, Odysseus swings into action. Obviously that digression is Homer digressing, not Odysseus and Eurycleia. So once Odysseus realizes that his identity has been revealed, he grabs Eurycleia by the throat and threatens her with death if she reveals anything. And that's an extreme and swift response, and it must be, because remember, she could reveal wittingly or unwittingly Odysseus' identity to Penelope, to the suitors, to almost anyone, could result in death and the failure of the plan. So he has to take action, even though he is fundamentally, choke slamming a 90-year-old woman or whatever she might be. He's got to do it. He has no choice, and it's a potentially tough decision for him, in a sense, in that she is a servant, but she did bring him up, and to have to do that instantly to her, a frail old woman, may have caused Odysseus some difficulty, perhaps, although maybe not. Remember, lower status characters who follow Odysseus don't tend to do very well out of it, and as a hero, one might argue all he thinks about is really himself. Yes, he's thinking about Penelope. Yes, he's thinking about Telemachus. But is that because of what they make him? Who knows? So, an important thing to think about. Why did Athene leave this scar? Why did Athene leave this potential way of revealing his identity? What other proof could Odysseus have offered? Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Why did Athene leave the scar? Are we simply looking at a kind of mishmash of different stories and tales and traditions? Or is it absolutely crucial that Odysseus has a means of identification? He's disguised as a beggar. How can he prove to Telemachus, or indeed anyone, who he is if Athene doesn't remove his disguise? And even if she does remove his disguise, remember, he's 20 years older than he was. There's, being slightly condescending, if you like, but, there are no photos, there are no passports, there's no, the only way you have identity is if everyone acknowledges your identity. If you think about it in a modern sense, it doesn't matter if you walk into a class and no one knows who you are. You have an ID card, you have online information, you have a passport, you can prove who you are. When writing exists, when documents don't exist, the only proof of identity is the acknowledgement of others. And that's quite an important thing. So perhaps it's a safety mechanism that Odysseus has this scar. Perhaps it's just a simple literary device. as always. I don't know if Odysseus could have offered much other proof. You know, information could have always been taken from Odysseus or bought from Odysseus or from someone else, but a scar, could that truly be duplicated by someone else? Anyway, give it some thought. So what I'd like to do now is turn to the function of speeches page in the workbook, and there's a couple of activities that I want you to do, and there's just a few ideas to kind of help you think about it, hear about the nature of speeches, the function of speeches, that sort of thing. There's no point in me talking you through them. You can just read about them in the workbook. The activity that I'd like to do, I will, in a separate document, give you the speeches that I want you to think about and basically complete the 4 associated tasks. What are the techniques used? What are the effects of the speeches in the context of the book? How do the speeches characterize the individual? And what important themes like Xenia, Kleos, etc., are highlighted? So you could just go through and annotate. You could print off and highlight, do whatever it is you want to, but consider answering all of these questions. Or rather, do answer them, but consider these things when you're doing it. Does that make sense? Who knows? It's late. Okay, now what I would like to do next, once you've done that, is read the article on Odysseus' scar, identify academic arguments. So where has the author put forward an idea, a piece of analysis that isn't a simple factual retelling, but is an opinion, and jot down at least 10. There's quite a lot there, so read through the article, jot down 10 good ones. That should be enough. That. So moving on, remember that Book 20 is not a set text. I'd really like you to read it, but if you can't, it's just a super swift run through of the important parts of Book 20. So in Book 20, the suitors plot to kill Telemachus again. So we know they're negative, we know they're naughty, we know they're abusing Xenia. Amphimenus stops them again. We know he is a good suitor. Is he? I don't know. It's give that some thought, give that some debate. But the important thing you need to take from this is that suitors are not one simple uniform mass. We then get, oh, this is a bit of, yeah, there we go, bit of graphics. We then get a suitor called Tisippus, who throws a cow's hoof at Odysseus, because remember he still thinks he's the beggar, and insults him. And once more, again, we just get this massive increase in tension. Odysseus almost loses it, almost reveals his identity. He could have ripped Tisippus' head off, but then he would have been killed by the others. But he stays calm, he keeps under control, but there is just this sense of boiling rage. He's been abused by the suitors. He's explored the impact of the suitors on Penelope and his household. He is an absolute mass of vengeance waiting to boil over. Then at the end of Book 20, Telemachus threatens the suitors, but they laugh at him. And Telemachus has a kind of prophetic vision. He sees blood on the walls, dripping down the walls, no doubt foreshadowing the death of the suitors. Anyway, that's just 6 really brief points about Book 20. So if you're struggling for time, effort and enthusiasm, then just take away those 6 points and you'll be absolutely fine. Anyway, that is the end of that, and I'll see you in the next lesson.